So Yasmin, thank you for the invite. To a certain extent, I feel like a little bit of an interloper because over the last number of years, I've been working less at the coalface of research than I had previously. But I was still delighted to be asked, and I hope I have something useful to say. I think you have a fantastic audience full of great people attending. And just to say, Matty, it's very good to see you. I was at a workshop recently, and one of Matty's colleagues gave an amazing talk about the Sustainable Development Goals in 6G, which I think is really, really interesting. And the 6G flagship looks fantastic. Anyway, it's great to be here. And what I really want to do in this talk is just pose some questions. And I have a warning here that they may not be answered because they're questions I've been asking myself recently, and I'm not really sure of the answers, but I actually thought it might be useful to throw them out at a workshop like this. And to do this, I've decided to go back a little bit to some research from ages ago, because the questions were relevant, and I kind of think it's good to bring them back up now as you look forward and say, you know, what's next for wireless spectrum management. So a good number of years ago, I was quite obsessed with the question, what kind of a good is spectrum? And this was kind of from an economics perspective. And, you know, there's all sorts of different ways of defining a good in economics. And we consume spectrum. So that's the way I think of it. And what way do what kind of a good is the spectrum that we consume? And when you look at that and you use economics terminology, first of all, there's this notion, and many people here probably know this, but I think it's worth talking through. There's a notion of kind of excludable goods, goods that are private, you know, like food or clothes that you might own yourself. Other kind of goods that are excludable, like, you know, if you go to the cinema, only so many people can go in, or private parks. So they're excludable goods. And then there's the non-excludable goods, like the common goods, like fish in the sea. So anybody can fish. And public signs, anyone can look at a public sign. So they're considered a non-excludable good. And then the other description that people often bring into the mix is this notion of rivalrous and non-rivalrous. So the top goods are considered rivalrous because if somebody consumes them, someone else can't. So if you're eating your food, somebody else can't eat it, the private food. If you fish in a commons and you fish, you can take all the fish out and there's a finite amount of fish there. And the non-rivalrous goods are ones that consumption by one person doesn't stop the other person consuming it at the same time. So we both can look at a sign and read the sign, or we can both breathe air and we're not stopping each other from doing it. So I suppose a number of years ago, people were using this language an awful lot to describe spectrum and to understand, as I said, what kind of a good it would be. And when you ask yourself the question, what kind of a good is it? The answer actually is that all of those descriptions apply, and that spectrum can be consumed as any type of a good. And I think this is really, really an important thing to think about. So I tried to draw some diagrams a number of years ago that I was very, very unhappy with, and I've only got it in text here because I don't think the diagrams really say it. But when I think of it, and when I think about technology, and I think about spectrum management, I think about how that technology development and that spectrum management influences the type of good it is. And for me, it simply divides in these two ways. So technology has developed to increasingly allow spectrum to be consumed as non-rival. So what we've been doing over the years is we've been pushing the technology boundaries to ensure that people at the same time can consume spectrum. And we've been doing that in increasingly interesting ways. And then in the spectrum management side, we've been developing management regimes to allow spectrum to be consumed in excludable and non-excludable ways. So an excludable way is, you know, an exclusive license, and a non-excludable way is a license exempt type of spectrum sharing. And there's all sorts of things in between where you can have pools, you can have brokerage, you can have auctions, and you can decide who gets to be in the club and who doesn't get to be in the club. So I look at the consumption of spectrum on a continuum. And that continuum allows spectrum to be consumed in many different ways. And in my head, I think of technology as pushing it around that continuum in the kind of non-rival rival way. And I look at spectrum management regimes as pushing it around the continuum in the excludable and non-excludable way. So the reason I'm discussing this, and I think it's relevant in the context of Iris, and it's relevant in the context of this workshop and the relevance of context of where we're going, is I certainly know that lots of interesting things happen here since I asked these questions many years ago. So if you look at the techniques and technologies that are emerging, there's so many exciting things in 6G. And there's less overall progress here. So Matty mentioned the fact that there's an increased focus now in local rather than national licenses, and that is absolutely true. But ultimately, when I stand back and look at it, a lot of the ideas that have emerged from when dynamic spectrum access began are still ideas, and there's still far few two regimes around the world that actually put those into action. And even the ideas of local and national licenses, even though we're now only beginning to see them in some areas, that idea has been around for a long time, including, for example, when you begin to look at a spectrum from a three-dimensional point of view, and you could imagine certainly at very high frequencies, there might be a different spectrum regime at the bottom of a skyscraper as there would be at the top of a skyscraper, if you know what I mean. So essentially, when I look at this, I suppose I ask myself the question, is there anything that can happen on the technology side that will make a difference on the spectrum management regime side and make us think differently? And I suppose I ask that question because I'm asking myself, where is the center of gravity of research for this domain? And I suppose I'm trying to put a mirror up to myself and say, is the center of gravity around the technologies that are needed to make the spectrum management regimes real or affordable? Or is the center of gravity around behavioral change or something else that's outside the sphere of the purely engineering? And I don't really know what the right answer to that is. So what I did in this, and it's just a small little exercise in asking, is there anything that can happen here that will call for anything different? So is there any technologies we can look at that might make something new or different or a new paradigm emerge? I looked at a report that the Ofcom in the UK produced. So Ofcom, most people here will know, is the UK regulator. I'm from Ireland myself, but as Yasmin pointed out, I chair a board on the UK regulator called the Ofcom Spectrum Advisory Board. And it's the most fantastic. Every single time I go to chair the board, I feel humbled because I just learn all sorts of new things. And Ofcom, I do think, is a very good regulator. So very recently, they brought out a report on technology futures, and they just did a scan of various technologies that are coming up and how those technologies might influence communications. Now, they have a very specific regulator's perspective on it, but the report is really, really lovely, really excellent. And if anybody has time, I'd certainly advise that people would read it. And I've taken a few things from it. So they've been looking at how, metamaterials, quantum, hybrid technologies, et cetera, have actually impacted on satellite, broadcast and media, fixed optical, mobile and wireless. So what I said to myself, okay, let's look at this report and let's look at some of the technologies that they're mentioning, and let's go back and ask the question, would that make me think any differently about spectrum management? So the next slide has a lot of text on it, and excuse me for that, but I just cut and paste some of the material from the report. And in the report, they picked out, for the wireless and mobile section, 4 areas that could have a major impact long term. And actually Ofcom did, actually, there's probably some people at this workshop today who input to this report. They actually talked to experts from around the world. And I think these were really, these were really, really interesting things that I think that they say, are really impactful. So the first thing they spoke about was beyond the traditional wireless communication limits, and that's going beyond Shannon. And the real focus in that section is about metamaterials. And Matty's already mentioned these things. Intelligent reflecting surfaces kind of pop out there. The second thing they spoke about was AI native systems. And I thought this was really, really interesting. And I think a real focus on how you could redesign transmitters and receivers um, using kind of blocks that are from AI rather than the traditional blocks, if you draw a traditional transmitter and receiver. And I thought that was really interesting. New radio architectures really that are very responsive, and they imagine that if they're modeled on these kind of AI native systems, that they're more adaptive. I suppose a kind of another form of cognitive radio. There was a lot of focus on hybrid technologies and moving away from cell-centric architectures to cell-free networks. And then there was also, and I saw it in Matty's slides as well, this kind of, I suppose, emerging trend where people use communications, where people use mobile communications for both sensing and communicating. And you're seeing, especially at higher frequencies, the fact that people are able to kind of use the same thing for dual purposes. And the reason I just picked those, partly I felt they were good things to pick as much of anything else, because I think Ofcom are put a lot of thought into this, and therefore good things to pick. But I would say to myself, none of these things are making me think any differently about spectrum management. So when I look at them, I think, okay, some of them are about higher frequencies, some of them are about arranging networks in a different way, but there's nothing in the armory of spectrum management regimes that people have listed that I think a paradigm that exists already wouldn't fit. And the only thing you could say in standing back from it, and when you look at it all, and I just picked out this one statistic, is that the usual thing is that we are beginning to use more and more and more and more for all of the things, and especially when people start to talk about the immersive work environments. And I just thought this was an interesting fact. They actually calculated the raw bit rate required to capture the activity of the whole brain in the report. And I just put it there as an interesting thing for us to think about. So my answer at the moment, and I would really, really love people to push back on this, is that in terms of paradigms or ideas or thoughts about the kind of concepts that you use to manage spectrum, nothing that's emerging is making me think there needs to be something else in that armory. A lot of things that are emerging makes me think we need to apply those things and change people's attitudes to them, but not necessarily that there's something missing from that space. So that's the first question. So the second question I want to throw out there in this is the following. And I'm this phrase naked spectrum. I noticed Martin Weiss is in the audience, and I heard this phrase from him first. I don't know whether he made it up or whether he got it from somewhere else. And I ask myself this a lot as well. So I started out life very much as a spectrum purist, and I have a diagram here from, I think it's back in 2007, and these are the kind of diagrams I was producing. You can see the 2G and 4G written there, so that's how long ago it was. And essentially at the time, I was really, really interested in dynamic spectrum trading and spectrum markets. And these diagrams were used to show how, if rather than give out these national licenses, that people could way more dynamically decide whether they had local or national licenses, and the trading kind of would figure that out. And a lot of the work that went on behind this was all about, well, if you're that generic and you're not specifying the technology, how do you deal with co-channel and adjacent channel interference? What kind of spectrum usage rights need to underpin things so this can all seamlessly happen? And I was really, really into this, and I really, really, really believed it. And then in the last few years, I worked on a project that was about the trading of spectrum capacity, the trading of capacity rather than the trading of spectrum. And that really began to shift my thinking about, is it all about naked spectrum? And are we, to a certain extent, making life harder for ourselves by sometimes constantly thinking of spectrum management and spectrum management regimes through kind of naked spectrum perspective only. So one of the projects I worked on, and I could put tons of details in here, and I didn't, but this just gives you a sense of it, was the notion that you took a network, and in this case it happened to be an LTE network. It was distributed over geographical space, and you could trade in capacity on that network in a really sophisticated way. I actually worked with Peter Crampton on it, who's an economist and really good at auctions. And the whole idea is that you could get capacity over a wide area, you could get capacity over really small areas, you could get capacity for a long amount of time, you could get capacity for a short amount of time. And we called it an open access wireless capacity network that you were able to trade. There was anyone could trade, big or small operators. And essentially what I'm doing in this slide here is just playing with the notion that the operator can kind of look different. You could have somebody who wants really, really remote surgery. You could somebody who wants to do IoT things and just need a little bit of capacity or a little slice. So I looked at that, and I mean, I found that very, very exciting, because it gave a kind of dynamism and dynamic access that was down to the millisecond or lower if you wanted it. And it removed, it to a certain extent, it freed up the ability to be completely dynamic in managing the capacity by locking down one thing, the infrastructure. Okay, so then I've been thinking about this in terms of how things are evolving. So that's just an example. So subsequently to that, I think a lot of stuff happened in terms of Internet of Things, smart cities, the lamppost grab. And you really began to realize, that the infrastructure and who owns the infrastructure, and you see it really, especially in large cities around the world, that who owns the infrastructure, where the hotspots sit, where the base stations sit, are so interlinked. And is it possible to think of these separately anymore? So some of the work that I began to do was about, how do you actually take assets, put them in a marketplace, and kind of co-design networks together. And I'm not, this slide is a complicated slide, and it's not necessarily that it's that really interesting. But the whole point is, for me, that I began to kind of link the infrastructure and the spectrum much more closely. So in throwing that question out there, I kind of now have started to think, okay, what does that mean for the intelligent reflecting surfaces? And this is just a diagram I took from a paper that has just an intelligent reflecting surface in it. And I was brought to mind of an entity that existed and is now defunct years ago. It was called the Wireless Friendly Building Forum. And the site can't be reached anymore. That's why I have this up here. And that Wireless Friendly Building Forum existed at a time when building regulations started to change in a way that made buildings into Faraday cages, really. There were things to do with, people were putting thicker glass or, triple glazed glass, and it was much harder to get buildings into us. And this forum was set up to encourage people to think more holistically about it. So the thought has come to me, and I don't know, again, people might want to push back against this, that if you start to think of spectrum and you move away from kind of dealing with spectrum in a more naked fashion, do you really need to start thinking of new alliances and how we understand how spectrum gets played out? I mean, I have a large interest in architecture myself, and probably I'm formed by that way of thinking. But I suppose what I'd say to summarize this question is spectrum gets performed into existence through infrastructure. And maybe that is a controversial statement, but to me, it's kind of pushing the question that we need to think differently about when we do spectrum management, and not think in the naked way anymore. So that was the second question. And then the final question I want to throw out to get us to think, are we thinking about anything new, or are we reinventing the wheel, is, and what really matters in the end? And this is just, I just have a small few slides here at the end. So I suppose one of the key things that we see and that we're facing in the world today is climate change. Certainly for all of you who work in universities, I don't know whether you notice it, but it's one of the key motivational topics of all the students that we deal with. And certainly I know that in my own university, that our students are no longer happy that we blasé continue in the way we have, in everything we do, in how we do our research, and in many more things. So when you look at a lot of what's happening in wireless communication systems over the last decade, all of us have been involved somewhere in some kind of research that has the word low power or energy efficient in it. And we do that kind of stuff. And you see it again popping up with 6G. And you also see people talking about the fact we're online helps avoid travel. And you certainly saw that with COVID, that we're, if you look at the but is it enough? And the answer is, it actually isn't. And one of the things that I suppose I'm throwing out there as my third question, if we want something really, really new, do we need to go hell for leather through things in a significantly different way? And I'm just going to use one example here. So there's a very interesting phone called Fairphone, and a project called the Dragonfly Project, where they look at the supply chains, deeply look at the supply chains of every element that goes into your phone, or every element that goes into a telecommunication system. And in this one, I've just picked up cobalt, and you'll see here on the right hand side, they show you all the places that cobalt can come from. They talk about how stable the country is. They really go into every single thing to do with the supply chain, as well as the fact that that element is a rare earth element itself, and they kind of pick it apart. So this Dragonfly initiative, if you get a chance to look at it, about sustainable businesses, it is really important. So I suppose my last question is, do we need to push much harder on this? And one of the things I always loved about the FCC was there was some kind of clause in when they were granting licenses. If all else is equal, you pick the most innovative, and it was kind of there to actually push innovation and get people to think differently. And I'm wondering, if all else is equal, at the very least, should we be picking the most green, but green in a really deep way rather than in a superficial way? And if we're doing that, does that mean we need to really go down to the actual materials that make the telecommunication systems that we use, and rethink things substantially? So that's the final question. So then, as I've called this an annoying summary, because I felt this is a workshop looking forward for your plans, and so I'm not necessarily answering these. So I'm just summarizing with the three questions, saying, no matter how technology is changing, is there anything that has happened that calls from some other spectrum management paradigm? For me, at the moment, no. Does spectrum management increasingly only make sense in the context of the infrastructure in which it is played out? For me, kind of. I wouldn't 100% go no in there. And should the fundamental basis of any policy to be drive significant change in practices to materially affect climate change? And I think we are at a point in life where, yes, and this doesn't need to be something tacked on at the end, or just this word low energy or energy efficiency. This needs to be something way more deep rooted. So they're my thoughts. I don't know how useful they are in the context of this workshop, but I thought it would be interesting to throw them into the mix. Certainly, I think it's kind of, you have fantastic minds at this, and I think it's a good place to throw out hard questions and to see what people think. So thank you.